Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to be looking at the multi-agentic chatbot workflow architecture diagram as to what we're going to be building, okay? So over here, you see this dotted line, and that just shows that essentially everything on the right is the multi-agentic workflow, and everything on the left is something that we're going to use to help us invoke it. So on the left, this is API gateway, and we're going to be building out an API that is going to be invocable, okay? And we're going to be using Postman to invoke it through the internet. And you can use whatever backend service you want, or you can use a front-end service, however you'd like. We're going to build out the entire backend, okay, on AWS. So that means you're going to be able to call it. Now, once you call API gateway, it's going to trigger a Lambda function. And then the Lambda function is going to hit the supervisor agent, which is going to be an LLM in an agentic form. And the supervisor agent is then going to transform the user's input, and it's going to decide whether the user wants to stay overnight at a hotel or an Airbnb, or whether the user wants to look for a restaurant. Now, if the supervisor agent doesn't have all the information it needs, it's going to ask the user for more information. And we're going to implement that through a chat session, which is going to be really interesting. So we're going to be able to chat with the supervisor agent. Now, once the supervisor agent knows what the user wants, for example, the user wants to stay overnight somewhere, then the accommodation agent is going to be called. And the accommodation agent is going to decide from the information given to it by the supervisor agent whether the user wants to stay at an Airbnb or a hotel. And remember, we're going to give specific search criteria. So for example, if it's an Airbnb, we're going to ask it, do we want a sauna in it? Do we want pets to be allowed? Do we want a pool? And the accommodation agent is going to help us do the filtering. And the accommodation agent is connected to an action group, and that action group is a Lambda function. And that Lambda function is going to be invoked by the accommodation agent with the appropriate filters, whether the user wants to stay overnight at a hotel or whether the user wants to stay overnight at an Airbnb. And we're going to be applying the specific search filters. So the Lambda function is going to be set up in a way so that it's going to be able to filter for whatever the user wants. And right now, the way it's set up is I have a separate hotels CSV file and a separate Airbnb's file, and both of them are located in S3 in different locations. And the accommodation agent is going to decide which one to invoke, whether the user wants hotels or whether the user wants to stay at an Airbnb. And the way that's going to work is, the supervisor agent passes all the information down to the accommodation agent, and the accommodation agent is going to call the appropriate function, whether the function should retrieve Airbnbs for us or whether it should retrieve hotels for us, okay? And right now, as I mentioned, both of these CSVs, the hotels and Airbnb CSVs, are in AWS S3. But, we're going to be able to set it up however way we want to. So if in the future you want it to query a Postgres database or a MongoDB database, you can set that up very easily. Now, this was if the accommodation agent was called. So this was if the supervisor agent has decided that the user wants to stay overnight somewhere. Now, what happens if the user is not interested in staying overnight anywhere? They just want to go to a nice restaurant. Well, the supervisor agent then realizes, okay, the user doesn't want to stay at a hotel or an Airbnb. That means I should send all the information to the restaurant agent. And the restaurant agent is going to ask the user whether, this is an additional search criteria, whether, which city they want to dine in and whether they want a fine dining option or not. Now, once the restaurant agent has all the appropriate information, it's going to call the Lambda function, which is the action group, and it's going to retrieve all the possible restaurants that fit the user's search criteria. Okay, and the unique thing about the accommodation agent is that, as you can see, it branches off. So that means the accommodation agent can decide which function inside of the Lambda function to call. Now, if that doesn't make sense, don't worry, because we're going to discuss that later, but we can actually define multiple functions inside a single Lambda function, okay? So that's why the accommodation agent is unique, because it's going to know which function to call within the Lambda function, whether to retrieve hotels or Airbnbs, okay? Again, if the user wants to go to a restaurant, the supervisor agent is going to pass the information down to the restaurant agent. It's going to set up the appropriate search criteria and search filters, and then it's going to retrieve all the information from AWS S3. Once the information is retrieved, they send it back, whether the accommodation agent or the restaurant agent, to the supervisor agent. And then the supervisor agent takes the response, formats it in a nice way that's presentable to the user, and then sends it back through the Lambda function, through API gateway, and back to, we're going to be using Postman. So we're going to get the results back in Postman printed to us. But again, this is super easy to implement in any kind of way you want. So it doesn't have to be Postman. If you have, an already existing application, it's very easy to build this into it, because then you don't use Postman to, invoke API gateway, but you use your backend or your front end. Okay. So I hope this sounds interesting to you, because this is super interesting and it is super new. So it's going to help you be in the top few % of engineers. So I will hope to see you in the next lesson.